Well, if you're just joining us, the breaking news that Pastor Terry Jones, having called off plans this afternoon for burning Qurans this weekend, is now reconsidering. We're back at square one, he says. That's after telling reporters earlier that a deal had been reached with the backers of the Park 51 Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan. In a nutshell, and I use the term advisedly, they would move the center farther from the World Trade Center site and he would cancel the Quran burning. The deal apparently never was. A lot of questions tonight, including this one. Where did Pastor Jones get the idea to equate Quran burning with mosque building in New York? Joining us now, senior political analyst David Gergen, political contributor and Democratic strategist Paul Begala, Zuhdi Jasser of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Jeff, we debated for a long time today whether or not to even cover this story. And then, of course, it took all these bizarre turns, and so then it became, well, we do cover this story. But this is sort of one of those agonizing things where this guy is clearly just an extremist. Clearly, I mean, he represents a few dozen people. He makes money by selling furniture on eBay to people who don't know it's supporting his little church. Is this just the media making him into something?
You had to cover the story today. The president's talking about it, Secretary Gates, General Petraeus. It's already a story. The mistake we made, including CNN, I think, is to give him publicity in the first place.
Although CNN, I mean, I know certainly we didn't really talk about him until General Petraeus came out and said this is a risk to U.S. forces.
Well,
which happened earlier this week.
That certainly, you know, that's makes it a story.
That's when the coverage blew up.
Right, but to give him attention, I mean, we would never consider covering some crazy person in the street, out on 58th Street, like yelling about Muslims.
Like the Westboro Baptist Church people, I wouldn't put on television.
Correct. This guy is no different. He's a bigot. He's a lunatic. He should not have gotten national attention. And that, unfortunately, is what led to this crazy spiral we're still on.
David Gergen, what do you make of all this?
Well, I think we've all been sucked in involuntarily into a freak show. This fellow's not just a lunatic, he's a jerk. He's been playing around with American lives. He is a publicity hound, and he does live off the oxygen of media coverage. But as I've learned more about it, I can see the dilemma the media organizations like CNN have faced. I mean, because it is true that when General Petraeus, acting in the best interest of the country, trying to protect lives, spoke out about this, it naturally prompted the media to start looking at him. I do think that we've now given him too much attention. And I do think that, well, if he decides to burn Korans, yes, you got to have a camera there to see if there's any violence, but I think we ought to downplay this.
Oh, see, I don't think anybody. I don't think anybody should show. I mean, I certainly would not air images of this guy burning Korans. I mean, I don't think anybody should show those images.
Well, if Al Jazeera does that, and we get some, we got a lot of protests around the world, I can guarantee you we're going to get sucked in again. But I think the faster we can turn these guys' microphones off and turn off the lights, the better, because he is living off the publicity. And I can't tell you how much this is damaging to the country now. I don't think I think it was unwise for the president to get as deeply involved as he has. I think it did give more legitimacy to this guy. But here we are, and I think it's time now to find a way to shut off the microphones.
And Zuhdi Jasser, you are opposed to building that mosque and Islamic Center near Ground Zero, although obviously they have the right under the Constitution. What do you make, though, of this pastor trying to insert himself into that? I mean, it just seems like the most craven attempt to extend his 15 minutes of surreal fame.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this guy and his congregation are a speck of hate and fear-mongering, and they basically are exploiting the situation. I think the lesson to learn here is the fact that we as a nation will never negotiate with terrorists or those that use extreme means of hate to try to manipulate the discourse. And I think similarly we've seen, and I think it's not just the media's fault. Remember, this guy put this issue on Facebook. It then got translated into different websites, the Islamist media. So I think the teaching thing from a reformist standpoint, I would say, is that we're in an information war. We need to start to take the offense and say, you know what, we're going to advocate for ideas of freedom and liberty and stand behind the Constitution, even though we may pay a price for it, just as when they had videos of our soldiers, God forbid, being beheaded, the cartoon issues. All of that is an information war that we have yet to even begin as Americans.
And yet, Paul, controlling information, I mean, information has become democratized. Anybody can put anything on the web. This guy will videotape, this pastor will probably videotape and put it on the web, and it will be out there.
Well, that's the thing. You know, I'm trying to move back who commented when and whether we should have covered it. And I think it's been an interesting conversation. But I think the reason General Petraeus commented on it, which is why CNN covered it, is because he had to. It's because, as Dr. Jesser says, it was getting out into the bloodstream through other ways. You know, back just even a few years ago when Gergen and I were working in the White House, if CNN didn't cover it, it didn't happen. Now it does. And this guy understands that. He gives crazy religious fanatics everywhere a bad name, but he certainly understands how to manipulate the media. I suspect even Paris Hilton thinks he's a publicity whore, but I don't really know what the answer is. I have to tell you, this is what I teach at Georgetown, the graduate school, and I would love to have you come down here and try to sort of sort through this after the fact, what the media's responsibility is here. But I don't think it's a very easy call, actually. And the real responsibility, morally, is with this preacher, right? He's the man who's inciting hate, and he's the man who ought to be held accountable for it.
A lot of this, David, though, I mean, when it first started to be mentioned, the idea that this pastor wanted to do this, it got coverage based on in sort of stories about Islamophobia around the United States. It got linked to, demonstrations in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and then an arson in Murfreesboro, Tennessee against a proposal to expand an Islamic center. So it was sort of seen in that light before people really started to focus on this one guy. Where does this end? I mean, if he now goes back on his word, do you think he's just trying to save face, as the imam earlier in the program said?
I don't think he knows what the hell he's doing, Anderson. He just wants to be on the air, I don't think he's not a rational human being. He's driven by forces we don't understand, and I think it was perfectly legitimate to cover him in terms of the Islamophobia. I do think he's representative of a fever that we see in the country that needs to be contained, understood, contained, and we have to talk our way through it. I would hope as we get copycats, they get less attention. I do think that he got to a place where he was getting a lot of interviews, and people were sort of putting him on. And we went live today with it, and I know that was a hard decision. It was a very hard decision for CNN to decide what to do when he went live today to make this preposterous claim that he reached an agreement with the imam. And I'm sure people at CNN, just as I'm sure there are people at the Pentagon wondering, did we overplay this? These are hard questions for all of us. Some guys standing on a street corner with a holding a stick of dynamite with the fuse lit. You sort of feel you got to go look at that. But he is manipulating us.
Let's move on from him. Zuhdi Jasser, the imam from the Islamic Center, proposed Islamic Center in New York, who was on CNN last night, essentially said that, look, this has now become a national security issue, whether or not this Islamic Center proceeds, whether it proceeds forward, whether or not it's in that space or not. Do you buy that this is now a national security issue?
Well, I think it's oversimplistic and actually irresponsible for the imam to focus on that element. It may be true on the battlefield for Petraeus, but for us as Muslims, if you truly are a reformer, you're not going to negotiate with terrorists. If we're going to truly stand for freedom and liberty, the reason my family left Syria and the reason I served in the Navy for 11 years was we learned as Americans, we don't let terrorists tell us what to do. We won't be threatened into submission, and we're going to stand by our principles no matter what. So if he believes that his mosque is real, and that was one of my problems with a lot of his statements yesterday, is that I constantly get the sense that the only lens that he sees things through is a narcissistic spiritual lens of Islam, and not through ones just of America, that we have our faith within us, we're under God. But ground zero is not about Islam. It's not about teaching Americans lessons. 71% of America are not Islamophobes. We've built over 2,000 mosques in this country without a problem. Yes, there were some controversies in some of the ones we've built, but America is not Islamophobic.
I think there's a mistake that we've been making in talking about the mosque, in focusing too much on how will people react in Al-Qaeda, in Taliban, who will use it for propaganda purposes. We cannot know, nor should we really care. These are evil, crazy people overseas.
And they will use just about anything that happens for propaganda purposes.
Exactly. They'll use anything in any direction.
But his point isn't, I think, just that, it's just the extremists. It's that it will make those who may be, not extremists at this point overseas, who are on the fence in Afghanistan, it will push them toward extremism.
Maybe. How can we predict how reactions will play overseas in these lands and among people we barely understand and know about. We have to be consistent with our values. We have to respect our law and, frankly, let the chips fall where they may. I think this idea of predicting responses is a fool's game.
Paul?
Yeah, in fact, Imam Rauf was on very strong, sort of all-American grounds if he would have stayed in his lane, which is as a spiritual leader, a community leader. And if he had simply stayed there, he's not an expert on national security. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about on that. But he certainly, I think, has a powerful argument in the greatest American tradition of religious freedom, religious liberty, religious tolerance. Communities have come here from all around the world, and they've built their houses of worship. You know, there was a time in American history when Catholic churches were being burned, when a convent was burned in Massachusetts, a church was burned in Philadelphia. My church, we overcame that prejudice, and I think the Muslims will.